Hey, God bless you. The Lord is speaking today, and we get to hear His voice. So let's tune into His Word together this morning. My devotions were in 1 Samuel 23, Psalm 31, Psalm 54, and Matthew chapter 7. And so if you haven't had a chance to read through these scriptures yet, this would be a great time to go ahead and pause the video and turn those scriptures on if you want to listen to them or jump into them. That's one of the goals within this devotional, that you would be able to jump into the scriptures and see what God's speaking to you through them, and hear what God's speaking through me to you through them, and see how they match up. And it's pretty cool when that takes place. And so you can always do that with these videos, and you can always find the devotional schedule on our Facebook to be following along. So this morning I'm in, again, 1 Samuel 23, Psalm 31, Psalm 54, and Matthew chapter 7. Sometimes I'll get through all of them and share something from all of them in time together. Sometimes the Lord will do that. And then other times I'll just get to a couple. So we'll see where we get to this morning. But I want to start reading out of 1 Samuel chapter 23, verses, let's just start in verse 1. It says, "Now they told David, 'Behold, the Philistines are fighting against Keilah and are robbing the threshing floors.' Therefore David inquired of the Lord, 'Shall I go and attack these Philistines?' And the Lord said to David, 'Go and attack the Philistines and save Keilah.'" And so it just got me to thinking, and it really admiring. We know that David is a man after God's own heart. And I think as followers of Jesus, that's something that we would all want. And so here's an example of what that looks like. David inquired of the Lord. How much are we inquiring of the Lord? I like to, almost on a weekly basis, really point out the fact that as followers of Jesus, we are being conformed into His image. We're being caused to look more and more like Jesus through our bad situations in our life, through our good situations in our life, through the situations in our life that feel good and those that are painful. God uses them all to cause us to look more and more like Jesus. And what does Jesus look like? One of the characteristics that jumps out to me right away is that Jesus only did what He saw the Father doing. And Jesus only spoke what He heard the Father speaking. And so there's this constant laying down of His own will for the will of the Father. And that's what we're called to look like. Now, as I give this encouragement, I totally recognize the argument that some people have brought up that, well, we're not Jesus. And okay, I get that. But we do have the Spirit of God dwelling in us. And we're invited into this life of continual sacrifice, continual laying down our cross, continual or picking up our cross, laying down our burdens before the Lord, and continually seeking to be Spirit-led, led by God. And so this is a great example of that, as we see David just inquiring of the Lord, what should I do? Here's the practical way that we do that in our lives, and asking this question of our own lives. How often are we laying our decisions before the Lord? Decisions to speak, decisions to go, decisions to do. Right? How often are we saying, God, what should I do? Because that's another opportunity for us to glorify God through choosing Him over ourselves. Right? There's that humility in it over a certain pride that I get to do whatever I want to do. It's a laying down of one's life to the true lordship of Jesus Christ. And I love that as David goes before the Lord and inquires of the Lord, God answers. And I think for many of us, we would hear the Lord's voice more often. We would recognize the Lord's prompting and the Lord's guiding more often if we would simply ask Him questions more often, if we would simply seek His guidance and His wisdom and His okay before we would step out and do things. I think we would see God move a whole lot more in our lives if we would simply seek Him more. The following verse in verse 3 of 1 Samuel 23 says, "But God's men said to him, 'Behold, we were afraid here in Judah. How much more then if we go to Keilah against the armies of the Philistines? How much more are we going to be afraid if we go there?'" And so we see this recognition of David's people that they're in hard times. And if they do this, it could get harder. But what's dictating that? What's dictating that decision? Their thought patterns. That's fear. They're making that decision on fear. And that's not, as people of God, that's not what we're called to. Not making these decisions and directions by fear. But also what I see within this, and the question that I want to pose for our thought and our processing and our conviction this morning is, how well am I being led? We've already talked about being led by God, being led by the Spirit of God, laying down our life and our desires and our will for God's will in our life and His direction in our life. But we also have to recognize that God's put leaders into our life. Not only has He placed leaders into your life, but He's empowered them by the Spirit of God to actually enable them to lead well, to hear His voice on behalf of others and direct people on behalf of the will of God. How well are we following the leaders that God has placed in our life? Are we being like the people of David and constantly questioning and constantly doubting their leadership? Or am I recognizing God's sovereign hand in placing that leader there, empowering that leader there, and trusting that they're following God because because they've proven to follow God? Are we being led well? We continue on, and in verse 4, again, we see David inquiring of the Lord again. It's just this constant example for us. Laying down our life, continuing to seek God and His direction. And then finally, I just want to end with this thought out of Matthew chapter 7. It was talking about the false prophets and how do we tell who's leading us well. And ultimately, we recognize that we were all called to be leaders. We're all called to lead someone. Maybe it's just one person. Maybe it's our family. Maybe it's tens. Maybe it's hundreds. Maybe it's thousands. I don't know. But God's called us to lead someone. We're called to make disciples. And as we're looking at those people in our life who are leaders, how do we figure out who to follow? And one of the ways that Jesus would direct us in is in Matthew chapter 7, verse 17. He says, "So every healthy tree bears good fruit, but the diseased tree bears bad fruit. A healthy tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a diseased tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus you will recognize them by their fruits." What's the fruit of the lives of the leaders that you're following? And what's the fruit of your life? That's the way that we will recognize them, by the fruit. Are we bearing kingdom fruit? Is there fruit of discipleship? Is there fruit of people giving their lives to Jesus? Is there fruit of encouragement, of peace? These things of God. Let's look at the fruit of our leaders' lives as well as our own lives so that we can lead well. Be blessed today. I love you guys. We'll see you again tomorrow.